He unexpectedly contacted his father, who had been deceased for 30 years, via radio. However, his father didn't believe that the person on the other end was his son from 30 years in the future, thinking he was being pranked. During the argument, the father accidentally set the glue on the table on fire with his cigarette. At the same time, burn marks began to appear out of nowhere on John's table. It was then that they realized they were not only using the same table, but their addresses and radio station numbers were identical, even though they were 30 years apart. Despite this, Frank still refused to believe. To prove he was telling the truth, John began to predict the outcome of the second World Series baseball game for Frank. Just then, the radio signal started to weaken. John, unable to continue explaining, hurriedly reminded his father that a fire would break out in an abandoned warehouse downtown the next day. As a firefighter, if his father wanted to survive, he must not take the seemingly safe route but instead take another seemingly dangerous path to avoid sacrifice. Half believing, Frank wanted to verify other information, but the radio signal was cut off at that moment. Although John didn't know if his father would believe him, he could only silently pray for him. Meanwhile, in another time and space, Frank was lost in thought, half believing what John had said. The next day, his fire brigade was calm, and the team members were engrossed in the exciting baseball game. However, he felt anxious about the game. Unexpectedly, the game's outcome was exactly as John had predicted. Just then, the fire station's alarm suddenly blared. Sure enough, a fire broke out in an abandoned warehouse downtown. Frank and his teammates quickly set out for rescue. On the way, he couldn't help but think seriously, as if John's prediction had come true. Could he really be his son from 30 years in the future? Moments later, the fire brigade arrived at the scene. Originally, they just needed to put out the fire, but when Frank learned there was a trapped person inside, he decisively rushed in to save them. Fortunately, he quickly found the surviving girl. But just as he was about to retreat, the staircase was burned and broke due to the intense fire. The ladder outside also malfunctioned at this time, unable to reach the window to rescue them. With no other choice, Frank had to find his own way out while carrying the girl. At this moment, two paths lay before him. One path was ablaze, while the other was filled with thick smoke. Instinctively, he wanted to choose the safer smoky path, but John's reminder made him stop. Then, he had no choice but to grit his teeth and rush into the flames. Beyond the fire, he unexpectedly found a conveyor belt for transporting goods. He slid down the conveyor belt with the girl. Afterwards, they successfully escaped safely from the other side of the building. Meanwhile, the path he initially chose exploded violently. At the same time, 30 years later, John was reminiscing about his deceased father with his friends. Suddenly, many memories about his father's heart surfaced in his mind. His father survived the fire, accompanied him throughout his childhood, and even celebrated with him when he became a police officer. But when he carefully searched his memories, he found that memories of his father still didn't span 30 years. Then, confused, he learned from his friends that his father had died of lung cancer caused by smoking 10 years ago. John excitedly rushed home, searched through records, and confirmed that the newspaper originally reporting his father's death had changed. It now covered his father's heroic act of saving a trapped girl. The photo of him and his mother had also changed to a family portrait of three. It turned out he really saved his father and changed history. At that moment, a line of engraving slowly appeared on the table, which read, "Squad leader, I'm still here." It was a message his father had left for him 30 years ago. This prompted John to eagerly turn on the radio, discovering that his father was indeed waiting for him. At this moment, Frank finally believed that John was indeed his son from 30 years in the future. They were both amazed by this miracle. Then, Frank learned from John that according to the original timeline, he, as an excellent firefighter, would heroically sacrifice himself in that fire accident, leaving only 6-year-old John and his mother to depend on each other. Heartbroken, John grew up betraying his father's expectations, choosing not to become a firefighter but a police officer instead. The loss of his father's love led to flaws in his ability to maintain close relationships, which recently caused his girlfriend to break up with him. Feeling down, he went alone to a nearby field to drink away his sorrows. On his way back, he noticed the sky was displaying a large aurora phenomenon, just like 30 years ago. It was on this day, while searching for something at home, he discovered the radio equipment left by his father back in the day. Missing his father, he found old photos and newspapers reporting the accident, and as he carefully went through them, the radio miraculously started working and he managed to talk to someone. At first, John didn't know who the other person was. After some time communicating, he found out that the other person also lived in Queens, New York, and was a die-hard fan of the Mets, just like him. The only thing that puzzled them was that the games that happened 30 years ago for John were yet to happen tomorrow for the other person. When he heard the other person call his son, Little Captain, John was shocked speechless. His father used to call him that too. Curious, he asked for the other person's name and found out it was the same as his father's. Utterly confused, he asked what year the other person was living in and discovered it was 30 years ago. This led him to suspect that the other person was indeed his father from 30 years ago. First, his father didn't believe it until his prediction saved his father from a fire. This might have been due to the recent aurora activity, which caused severe solar flare interference with radio waves, allowing them to communicate across 30 years. Hearing this, Frank was filled with emotion. The two then opened up completely, talking about everything from 30 years ago to future technology and life. But most importantly, the results of the upcoming Mets games. Gradually, the radio signal began to weaken, but neither of them wanted to stop. John reminded his father to quit smoking, or he would die of lung cancer in 20 years. Finally, after 30 years, John emotionally said, "Dad, I love you," and hung up the phone. Frank then happily went to the hospital to visit his wife on duty. He hugged his wife tightly. She was quite puzzled, but Frank knew it was the joy of surviving a disaster. At that moment, his wife, who was a nurse, noticed that a nurse had given the wrong medication to a patient. She quickly intervened, successfully preventing a medical accident. That night, 30 years later, John had more unpleasant memories in his sleep, with images of attending his mother's funeral flashing through his mind. John woke up feeling very uneasy and hurriedly called his mother, who worked at the hospital. However, he found that his mother's phone number had turned into a fast food delivery number, and his mother was missing from the family photo. In a panic, John rushed to his girlfriend to discuss the situation. Unexpectedly, his girlfriend didn't recognize him at all. Apparently, his successful act of saving his father had triggered a butterfly effect. At that moment, her colleague, Uncle Hay, urgently called her to the police station. It turned out that there was new progress in a burial case she was responsible for. This case was reported a few days ago when workers discovered the remains of a woman buried for many years at a construction site. At that time, John visited the nearest residence, hoping to get some useful clues. The residents were an elderly couple. From the elderly couple, he learned that their son was also a police officer, but unfortunately, he died in the line of duty at a young age. After failing to get any useful information, John quickly left the couple's home. Now, Uncle Hay told him that according to the technical team's investigation, the buried body was the 10th victim in the Nightingale serial murder case. After hearing this, John was in disbelief. He clearly remembered that there were only 3 victims in this case. The killer's method was extremely brutal, first using tape to bind the victims' arms behind their back, then strangling them, and finally taking a small item from the deceased as a memento. Since all the victims were nurses, this case was also known as the Nightingale serial murder case, and to this day, the killer has not been caught. When he skeptically took the information from Uncle Hay's hand, he was shocked to find that the number of victims had indeed increased from 3 to 10. Later, as he flipped through the case files, he almost fainted. He discovered that his mother was among them. Realizing the gravity of the situation, he hurried home, only to find that his mother's image had disappeared from the family photo. Why had things turned out this way? It turned out that according to the unchanged timeline, if his father had died in the fire, his mother would have been too grief-stricken to go to work, and the killer would have died due to a medical accident caused by a nurse's mistake, leaving the case unsolved. She had only killed 3 people, but because John's spoiler successfully saved his father didn't die. That night, the mother was working her regular shift at the hospital and happened to correct a nurse's mistake with the IV, not only saving the killer but also leaving an impression on him as he lay in bed, making her his target. That night, John used the radio to contact his father again and told him about the mother's murder by the killer. After John's careful analysis, previously, the father sacrificed himself, and the mother was fine because she didn't go to work at the hospital. After his spoiler, the father didn't sacrifice himself, and when the mother went to work at the hospital, she was killed. This indicates that the mother's death is closely related to whether she went to work that night. This realization made Frank feel extremely guilty, as he didn't expect that his own survival would indirectly lead to his wife's death. Thinking of this, a bold idea emerged in John's mind. Since they now have an advantage, as long as they plan carefully, they can definitely have the father catch the killer. Although they don't know who the killer is, with the case files in hand, they know what he will do next. Then, he went through the files and found the next victim's profile, which showed that tomorrow night, the victim would go to a bar after work, then be followed by the killer and murdered in the alley behind the bar. So, as long as Frank goes to the bar to watch over the victim, he should be able to spot the killer following the victim. The next night, Frank went to the bar as the evidence suggested, but unexpectedly, the victim recognized him at a glance and even invited Frank for a drink. Knowing that Frank was afraid the victim would be harmed, he chatted with him the whole time, causing the killer to abandon his target. The next day, when John arrived at the police station, he found that the victim's file had mysteriously disappeared. This indicates that although they didn't find out who the killer was, they successfully saved a life. That night, John contacted his father again, and since they didn't find any information about the killer yesterday, this time, John told him the time and place of the next victim. He repeatedly reminded his father to be extremely careful during the operation because the killer is very cunning and has strong counter-surveillance abilities. While they were talking, the mother came over with young John and his childhood friend. Frank didn't tell his wife who the person on the other side was, only saying it was a policeman with the same name as their son, talking to the young mother. This made John both excited and nervous. When John learned that his childhood friend was right across the street, he decided to give him a gift that could change his fate, ensuring he would always remember the name Yahoo. he repeatedly urged him to carve the name on his door as soon as he returned to his room, and to seize the opportunity the next time he heard it. On the night of the incident, Frank returned to the bar following clues. He deliberately engaged in endless conversation with the victim of that night, hoping to deter the killer once more. Unfortunately, due to a lack of professionalism, Frank not only failed to identify the killer but also ended up being outsmarted by them. Frank planned to take advantage of the victim changing clothes to use the restroom himself, but as soon as he entered, he was ambushed. After knocking Frank out, the killer rummaged through his wallet and unexpectedly found a photo of his wife inside. The killer took his driver's license. Just as the killer was about to silence him permanently, someone entered the restroom, interrupting the plan. So, she threw Frank into a restroom stall. When Frank regained consciousness, she quickly rushed to the victim's residence, but she was still a step too late. The woman had already been brutally murdered by the killer. Subsequently, Frank hurried home and remorsefully reported the incident to John via radio. Not only did her plan fail, but the killer also took her driver's license. He worried that the killer would use the license to locate his address, putting his entire family in constant danger. However, John became excited upon hearing this. He believed that since the killer had touched the wallet, their fingerprints would surely be on it. Considering the time his father lived in, fingerprint technology was not advanced. So, he instructed his father to seal the wallet in a plastic bag and hide it in a place at home where no one would find it. In this way, 30 years later, John found his father's wallet in that very spot. Then, he immediately took the wallet to the police station for fingerprint analysis. However, the results left him completely stunned. The notorious Nightingale killer turned out to be a police officer. This instantly made him understand why the killer had such high counter-surveillance and combat skills. The killer was also the son of that elderly couple. Thus, John decided to visit them again. Because history had changed, the elderly couple's home had also transformed significantly. In the house, the wife, who was a nurse, had been murdered 30 years ago. At home, there's only his elderly father left, and John, the son who retired from the police force and is now working as a private detective. Based on the location provided by the killer's father, they found the elderly killer in a bar. He threw the photo of the killer's murdered mother in front of him. I know you did all those cases, including killing your own mother. It turns out that back then, the killer frequently committed crimes and was afraid of arousing police suspicion. To avoid suspicion, he even killed his mother, who was a nurse. In this way, he transformed from a suspect into a victim's family member. Thus, he successfully avoided the police search. John confidently told the killer, "Just wait, 30 years ago, you were doomed." Unexpectedly, he spoke too soon. After John returned home, he quickly used the radio to tell his father the identity of the killer. Then, he urged his father to call the police immediately. However, before Frank could take any action, Officer Black showed up at the door first. He suspected Frank was involved in the Nightingale serial murders because the killer struck again last night and left Frank's driver's license at the scene. Although Frank knew the killer was framing him, he had no evidence to defend himself. Now, he was about to be taken away as a suspect. But Officer Black was a longtime friend of Frank's, and out of friendship, he gave him a few minutes to say goodbye to his family. Taking advantage of this moment, Frank quickly went back inside the house. He wanted to ask John how to prove that the officer was the killer. However, Officer Black thought he was trying to tip off an accomplice. So, he hurriedly stepped forward to stop him, and in the struggle, the radio accidentally fell to the ground and broke. Thus, the 30-year communication between John and Frank was cut off. Meanwhile, John discovered that the newspaper about his father's rescue had turned into a report about the serial killer. Soon, his father was taken to the police station. With no one to turn to, he had to reveal the entire story of how he and John used the radio to cross time and space to catch the killer, directly pointing out that one of the officers in the station was the murderer. But Officer Black didn't believe in the time travel story at all, thinking it was just nonsense to escape suspicion. Helpless, Frank, in order to convince Officer Black, revealed the results of the upcoming World Cup. The Mets would win the championship. I thought this would make Uncle Hay believe, but Uncle Hay felt, I treat you as a friend, but you treat me like a fool, do you know that? You were seen by a neighbor going to the deceased's house last night, do you know that? The deceased's house is covered with your fingerprints. If you don't confess honestly, even Jesus can't save you. As I said, it wasn't long before Frank's wife also came to the police station. She wanted to know what crime her husband had committed. The two agreed to meet at a cafe. Just as Uncle Hay was struggling with how to tell her, the commentary on the game on TV caught her attention. Unexpectedly, the result of the baseball game was exactly as Frank had said. The incredulous Uncle Hay then realized that everything Frank said might actually be true. Meanwhile, the killer used his identity as a police officer to smoothly enter the interrogation room and found Frank. He was very curious about how Frank had found him out. As he spoke, he pointed the gun in his hand at Frank. Just then, an old policeman who heard the commotion pushed the door open to see what was going on. Seeing this, Frank quickly called out to him for help, but the killer calmly showed him his police badge. This left the puzzled old policeman with no choice but to take him outside for questioning. the killer quickly lied, saying he was investigating a robbery case and the suspect's description matched Frank, which is why he was questioning him. With that, the old policeman believed his story. Seeing his situation was very dangerous, Frank had to save himself. Using his professional knowledge as a firefighter, he pulled down the wires from the wall, took out the copper wire, tied one end to the iron mesh, then tied the other end to the door handle, and finally poured 2 cups of water at the door. When the killer returned to the interrogation room, he accidentally stepped in the water, and Frank calmly smoked a cigarette and threw the wire at the killer's feet. In an instant, the intense electric current knocked the killer to the ground. Frank immediately took out the killer's wallet and noted the address on the driver's license. Then, he found a lighter on the killer and used insect spray to trigger the smoke detector. In just a few seconds, the entire police station was in chaos. Frank used a file folder as a disguise and calmly escaped. Then, he sneaked into the killer's house to look for clues. Since the killer had a habit of collecting victims' belongings, finding what he collected would be enough. Before long, he found a box containing the victim's jewelry in an inconspicuous spot in the storage room. Now, he finally had evidence to clear his name. However, before he could leave, he ran into the returning killer. It turned out that the killer, who had been knocked out, quickly regained consciousness under the cold shower, realizing that Frank would definitely come home to find evidence, so he rushed back immediately. The moment the killer saw Frank, he fired his gun, leaving Frank with no choice but to jump out the window to escape. Then, using his firefighter climbing skills, he agilely dodged, with the killer closely pursuing him all the way. Unexpectedly, when he reached an abandoned dock, he lost sight of his target. While he was cautiously searching around, Frank, hiding under the planks, suddenly reached out and dragged the killer into the water. For Frank, being a firefighter, the water was undoubtedly his home turf. With a few punches, he sent the killer sinking into the water. Finally, exhausted, he climbed ashore. Meanwhile, Black Uncle, following the clues Frank had provided earlier, found the killer's residence. Upon seeing the crime evidence scattered on the ground, he suddenly realized that Frank's suspicion was completely cleared. Soon after, he found Frank still by the water. Then, he called for a boat to retrieve the killer's body. Unexpectedly, they found nothing in the end. Frank then hurried home and quickly began repairing the radio because the news reported that the sun would calm down tomorrow, which might be his only chance to talk to his son. Knowing the importance of this, his wife brought him cigarettes and coffee to help him relax. Frank instinctively picked up a cigarette, but remembering his son's advice, he chose to throw it in the trash. Fortunately, it wasn't long before he fixed the radio and successfully connected with his son again. He excitedly told his son that the killer was dead. But John strangely found that nothing had changed, as there was still no mother in the house. Just as the two were puzzled, John was suddenly knocked down by the elderly killer who appeared out of nowhere. He wasn't dead but had lived for another 30 years. The two immediately engaged in a fierce fight. Hearing the sounds of the fight over the radio, Frank realized his son might be in danger. However, he didn't have time to react. 30 years ago, the killer found him in the city, knocked him out with a punch, and handcuffed him to the railing. It turned out he didn't drown in the water but managed to escape. Then the killer went upstairs, intending to deal with his sleeping wife first. In a critical moment, his wife's scream woke John up. He quickly used his foot to reach a tool and easily unlocked the handcuffs. He then picked up a shotgun to take down the killer, but the killer grabbed his son as a hostage. Seeing his son's life threatened, Frank had to put down the gun. At this tense moment, his wife suddenly lunged at the killer, allowing young John to escape. Seeing this, Frank quickly picked up the gun again just as the killer broke free. As the killer chased young John, Frank shot the killer's hand, injuring it. He wanted to fire more shots, but the killer quickly escaped. Meanwhile, on the other side, John was being held at gunpoint by the older killer. Just as the killer was about to shoot, his right hand began to rapidly wither away until it disappeared, and the room's layout started to change. History was successfully rewritten once again, but for some reason, the killer didn't disappear. Just then, a gun barrel appeared and shot the killer dead on the spot. The shooter was the older Frank. At that moment, he was like a lion protecting his family. He had survived until now because he heeded John Jane's advice and avoided lung cancer. At this moment, fate's boomerang brought the father and son, separated for 30 years, back together. They embraced tightly, and the family of 3 was finally reunited. Soon after, John and his girlfriend got married and started a new family. His childhood friend, guided by John, invested heavily in Yahoo stocks and became a success in life. All of this was because the time-traveling call changed history, giving everyone a wonderful life. Black Hole Frequency, directed by Gregory Hoblit and starring Dennis Quaid and James Caviezel, is a sci-fi film released in 2000. It tells the story of a father and son meeting across time on screen, showing us that it's not just a sci-fi thriller but also an emotional revelation for contemporary audiences. When John talks to his father from 30 years ago through an old radio, he saves not only his father's life but also his own heart that has never truly been at peace. The film uses a rescue across time and space to tear open our most hidden emotional wounds. Are those unspoken words of love destined to become eternal regrets? In the movie, the crackling radio is our emotional bond with our loved ones. The so-called miracle of parallel universes is just a slap in the face to our reality. We live in the same time and space, yet silence becomes the greatest distance. Why wait until the brink of life and death to express the apologies and I love yous that are trapped in our hearts? The director wraps a harsh truth in a sci-fi shell. The biggest black hole in life is never the time and space we can't traverse, but the false hope that there will always be a next time. In reality, how many sons, like John, wait until their father's deathbed to realize they've never shared a drink with him? How many daughters discover a scarf never given while sorting through their mother's belongings? In the movie, the father and son can rewrite the book of life and death, but in reality, the only weapon we have against regret is immediate action. At the end of the film, when the father and son embrace again after 30 years, the sci-fi story finally reveals its tender core. The only thing that can truly transcend time and space is the most primal human emotion. Science may not yet prove the existence of parallel universes, but every moment lived to the fullest, every warm embrace, creates a frequency universe of our own. The so-called miracle of changing history is just ordinary people making the most extraordinary choices. Well, that's all for today's movie sharing. Please like, comment, and share. Looking forward to our next encounter.